Hello, welcome to Time to Say Goodbye. It is the 4th of June. It is the 5th of June when we're recording, or when you're hearing this. And today we have a great episode. I think it's going to be a very engaging and pretty jam-packed conversation. So we're going to just get it started. We're not going to do the usual chit-chat at the start of the show. Tyler is in Montauk, and so if you hear birds in the background, that's because of Tyler. It's actually I found it somewhat soothing, but I imagine that others might find it annoying at some point. But just pretend you're at a golf tournament. Our guests today are the authors of the new book, "What Are Children For?" on ambivalence and choice. It is written by Anastasia Berg, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. She is also a senior editor of The Point magazine, and Rachel Wiseman, the managing editor of The Point. We do have a lot of authors here on the show, and we always give them a choice, which I actually have realized is almost worse than just asking them what their book is about, because then but we have a choice. You can be like, I can describe the book, or you can describe the book. So whatever is easier for you.
That's a good question. I want to hear your description.
Okay, yeah, I'll just try and do it off the top of my head because I did. Um, I This is a book that is about the question of why there is a huh. It is a I think that it is an intervention, right? It is a book that should be labeled as an intervention in a good way, in which that there are a lot of discourses happening right now and a lot of political movements happening, whether on the left or on the right. And the ones on the right, I think, as you two point out, are pretty scary, right? The anti-abortion push, the sort of ways in which the right is trying to normalize very, very rigid ideas of family. And that on the left, there is a general anxiety about the future of the world, right? That seems almost overwrought at times, or overdetermined. So you see that in something like climate change, right? Or you see that in conversations about somebody like David Benatar, who's a South African philosopher, who basically has argued that it is immoral to have children. And you see it in terms of economic anxiety, right? And people saying we can't afford to have these children. And what this book does, I believe, is say to everyone, here is why, in a gentle and kind manner, we believe that your logic on a lot of this stuff is very wrong. That was my favorite. As like a debate bro, I was like kind of thrilled by this book in that way. I was like, damn, they got him, a couple times. And then and that the idea is kind of like maybe we should chill out a little bit. Okay, how did I do in describing the book?
I am very glad we went for option number two. This was
Okay.
very fun for us. Um, I suppose that the only thing I would add at this point is that in addition to the kind of appeal to the debate bros, we do think of this book as also providing a kind of guidance, and that's implicit in something you said, Jay. So I think there's a joy of getting somebody in an argument, but there's also the pleasure and I think the significance of lifting the burden of certain kind of narratives that we think are making it very hard for people to approach this question. You might say authentically or freely. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to scoring points, which I'm glad you enjoyed, I too am a philosophy bro at heart. I think we also are trying to help people navigate this choice. We are not in a position to tell them what they do. So if you think we will tell you whether or not to have children by the end of this book, that's not going to happen. We don't think this is the way to approach a profound ethical question, but hopefully we're going to help you think about it more clearly.
Right, right. Ty, what did you think about the description of the book? Did that match what you read as
Yeah,
well?
no, absolutely. I think, I think this is something you and I are both interested in, Jay, which is why we're so excited to have you two on. It can feel like the way in which, like, on the one hand, the right is having this conversation about the family. Um, that is often very regressive and reactionary, but that also gets at something about like the challenges endemic to having children, family life, affording them in the 21st century, even as the solutions the right puts forward are grotesque. And it feels like an intervention, like Jay said, that is trying this sort of um, not quite debunk, but resituate some of the anxieties, ambivalence, and questions that we tend to see on the left. That is in general more skeptical about the question of family, parenthood, motherhood, etc. So I really liked it, and I agree. It appealed to my kind of. I did not do debate, but it did appeal to my sort of philosophy broke predilections. But I also thought it kind of read like a really superb and very smart, like, I don't mean self-help in a bad way, but like actually usefully trying to like help people through like what is the right way to think about this. And I just, yeah, I thought it really refreshing. Like if more books that aimed to give people, you don't quite give people advice, but you do, help reframe a really fraught debate. If more books were this smart that were kind of doing that, I think we would be in a better place overall. But yeah, no, I thought your description was great, Jay.
Okay, thank you. I feel validated about it. But okay, well, I have a question for you that I wanted to start with, which is that the book structure is interesting to me, in which it starts with an essay by you, Rachel, right? And you do not have children, or at least at the writing of this book, you did not, and so you are sort of on one side, right? And the book ends with an essay called, I think it is Hello. It's like, is it Hello from the Other Side or From the Other Side, right? And it is by you,
Yeah, I think it's
It's
Anastasia.
the
hello from
Adele
the other
song.
side.
Okay. I was like, is
It's
this
an Adele
about? I didn't
quote.
want to be like, I don't want to put the Adele song on them if they didn't intend it, but I was like, but I think
There
it
were
is the Adele
more
song.
there were more pop culture references in the book before "Must Be the Money," but it didn't appear in the final version.
You're making like a party playlist like that. I don't know. I
Totally.
would
Totally.
the and now Anastasia, you write about motherhood at the end, right? And so it's like kind of like both sides of this question. What sort of possessed you to write this book together, and how is that formative in the way that it came out?
Yeah. Well, we structured the book as a sort of conversation between two friends. And so the way that the book is set up for those who haven't yet read it is, yeah, it starts off with a personal essay by me where I sort of describe the dilemma faced by people who are kind of outside of this decision and facing it down and trying to think through, do I want kids? I'm not sure. Why am I not sure? It seems like I should know. And then the concluding essay is written from the perspective of Anastasia, who has now two children, and is kind of talking about the experience of becoming a mother, quote unquote, and the ways that there are certain kinds of narratives that make it kind of even more challenging in some ways to experience that transition. And then the central chapters are written in kind of a joint, omniscient voice, and they address the material concerns that people have when they're approaching the question. We do a history of feminism. We talk about motherhood ambivalence literature, and also then the sort of ethical concerns that are raised, particularly in the context of climate change. And part of the reason that we decided to structure the book as a conversation is because many of the investigations of ambivalence about having children are written in a very kind of first personal, super subjective way. It is a really personal question, but we also think that there needs to be an active conversation about it, and that many books have, and much of the conversation has kind of uh, receded from thinking about things in terms of a public conversation that we can have together. And it's only by getting out of that kind of subjective frame do we think that there's actual progress that can be made.
So you're
I'll add to
talking
that.
about. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Just to
I'll just
clarify,
say,
just to clarify for the listeners, I think that you're saying that the conversation, because they're not all as well versed in this, but it's sort of newspaper columns, books that are written from the first person perspective of somebody who is basically saying, this is why I feel this way personally. And then people extrapolate some larger meaning out of it. So, for example, I think you use an example in the book, which is like somebody says, after Dobbs, I cannot have children. Like before, I was maybe open to it, but now I cannot because the world is this way and politics are this way. So that's just a way to clarify. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Anastasia. Go ahead. Yeah.
no, not at all. I was just going to expand actually on that point exactly, which is that the book responds to, as Rachel was saying, to a real lack that we saw in the public conversation. So one kind of failure, that's the subjective failure that you described, Jay, is the right. It's this kind of, I'm going to report on my knee-jerk reaction to it. And especially on the left, we see a tendency to link political failures or political threats to reproductive choices. So I'm worried about climate change. I'm not going to have kids. I'm worried about Dobbs. I'm not going to have kids. I'm worried about the fact that we don't have a social welfare system. I'm not going to have kids. We quote AOC has made two of these points in two separate on two separate occasions. So on one time it says, well, of course they're not having kids because of the climate. And of course they're not having kids because it's too expensive and we're not supporting them. There's another element of it, which is what I think also Rachel was thinking about, is that there has been a literary genre. It's gotten the title of the motherhood ambivalence literature. And that was kind of a flurry of books written in the first person describing the inner workings of either a woman trying to decide whether or not to have children or somebody who's just had a child and I don't mean this cynically, but sort of bravely willing to talk about how motherhood sucks. And so the ambivalence was really, when we talk about ambivalence in psychoanalysis, we think about the ability to have two very different attitudes towards one and the same object. This is an accomplishment. But in that genre of literature, the emphasis was on the bravery of saying the truth about motherhood. It is hard. Right. It is boring. It is isolating. And so today, and we talked to hundreds of people for the purposes of writing this book. And when we talk to them about what are the kind of things they turn to when they're trying to navigate this choice, they'll talk about reading those books as, to go back to what Tyler was saying, as self-help. Now, as a guide, what the book recommends and puts as an ideal is the state of ambivalence. So like the intellectual, artistically inclined, smart woman is supposed to be kind of perpetually ambivalent. And it's a very kind of sophisticated position. So that's what's going on the one hand. On the other hand, when you talk about declining birth rates, if you're not just, it's not just a sort of right-wing talking point, people are talking about ground historical trends, right? So they'll correlate declining birth rates with any other kind of historical change. So they'll say, birth rates decline with increased secularization, with the modernization of the economy, with women getting an education and going out to work, the sperm count. But for us, in a way, you can think of it as some synthesis of these approaches. We said, well, look, a grand historical narrative does not feature as a salient reason in my thinking about whether or not to have children. I'm not thinking how many years of education do I have for this to be somehow helpful in this decision. But we didn't want to continue romanticizing the state of perpetual ambivalence. So what we wanted to do is start with the kind of concerns that people raise and investigate them one by one to see what's underneath them. So to take them really seriously, but also to push beyond their kind of surface appearances.
Yeah, I thought that's what was really valuable about the book in particular, is that I do think there is, one of the words I kept coming back to as I was reading this, that sort of that you never use, but that it felt like at times was on the tip of your tongue, was like narcissism. Like there is this like way in which the like sort of the ambivalence, and particularly the fiction you examined in particular, is like you point out that it's so focused on the self that there's like not even a community or like friends don't enter the picture. It's as though like the individual is this isolated unit, sort of beset with this choice in which society is totally absent, and I really do think, the right is so regressive on family issues, but you guys are, I think, without being remotely scolding and really open-minded and like, trying to restore, I think, a sense of agency in what does feel like a really sort of beclouded sort of cultural moment around parenthood, particularly on the left. But at the same time, I really do think you cut through some of the. Again, I don't want to frame your book as myth busting, but you do helpfully resituate some of the, I think, intellectual sticking points that can come with the sort of parenthood decision. One of which is financial anxiety, which I thought your take on was really, really smart. and both sensitive, but again, also pushing back on kind of the received wisdom. So, and I'd love to hear more about sort of your take on this broadly. But I mean, you point out that one of the narratives about why millennials aren't having children, and I think one thing we should add is that your book is like really focused on the sort of millennial condition, right? Insofar as, I think we're all millennials, are in the kind of the age in which the parenting question is a live one. But one of the dominant media narratives, right, is that millennials aren't having kids because of financial anxiety and because, they don't feel like they're in a place to give their kids a life as good as the one they had as a child, let alone one that might be better, which used to be the kind of expectation, right? But you point out that, there's this American narrative that this is about the failure of the social safety net, and that there's, we don't have strong support for parents, and we don't have good, parental leave, et cetera, all of which is very true. But you point out that countries that do have those things, like Nordic countries, South Korea, where there's a different incentive structure for having kids, et cetera, they're still being beset by this issue, right? And so I'd love to hear more about sort of, because I think those of us on the left, we do default to the sort of financial precarity angle. So I'd love to hear more about sort of how you thought about that in your book. And then later, I loved your point about this grand historical narratives. That's something I want to ask you about later when we talk about sort of the climate change anxiety piece of this. But anyway, yeah, I'd love to hear you guys say that more about sort of how the financial anxiety, I won't call it a myth, but that narrative fits into your thinking with this book.
So the main piece of evidence that we draw attention to is to at least make us a little bit less comfortable with this explanation as a go-to is in fact that comparison to the kind of countries where there's robust support for family and children and universal health care and you name it, they have it and they're still not having kids. Of course, you could have two separate explanations for why the Americans aren't having children and why people in the rest of the world are not having children. That seem to us less likely. And then on the technical level, another part of the argument is just to kind of join the voice that has been doubting the narrative of millennial complete financial doomerism. So people have been paying attention to the way in which, according to a lot of measures, millennials are doing better than they sort of were led to believe or perhaps sometimes feel. However, I think, like you were saying, you guys were mentioning, and it was very gratifying to hear you say, oh, it's sensitive and it's open-minded. I mean, our point is not to, it's not a gotcha argument against people who claim, and we're not trying to get the left. On the financial concern, what interests us is, so yeah, we put aside this idea of children are strictly unaffordable or it's just financial concerns that are motivating not having kids. But we think that there's something really interesting that's sort of the core underlying what is expressed as the surface concern with affordability. And it's a certain kind of way, a narrative of how our life should look like. And in particular, and this is true of both people's personal development, professional and financial development, and their romantic development, the perceived wisdom is that we should be spending our 20s and early 30s, quote unquote, discovering, establishing, and fulfilling ourselves. Okay. So financially, I have to find out what the career that I want is, and I have to make myself incredibly secure before I can even think about having children. That is true also within relationships. I have to be first of all, I have to spend all my 20s dating casually because it'd be insane to try and find a serious partner when I'll be too young. How would I know? I would make a mistake. I'm not formed yet. And I have to find out who I am. So with therapy, etc. And only then can I start not having kids. People say people are having kids late. People aren't having kids late. People are starting to think about kids late. They're not even thinking about kids until late 20s, really early 30s, mid 30s. And this is about women. I mean, men have the kind of luxury of not thinking about it at all. So they're not even thinking about kids because they're thinking, I'm not financially secure yet. I'm not professionally secure yet. I'm not in a position to I'm not a serious person. When I'm acting like an adult, I'm adulting, which means I'm cosplaying. And then I start thinking about having kids, which means dating with a view to having kids so late that a lot of people end up having fewer kids than they want or just being edged out. And the decision to have kids is being made for them because of the way they're conducting themselves in the kind of grand sort of arc of their own lives. So that's a place where, and that's, I think, true of a lot of these things. It's not that people are just wrong and deluded about finance. It's that the way they're thinking about the way that finance and professional concerns is working in their lives is a bit different.
And also they tend, in addition to thinking of kids as a kind of thinking of the decision as something that requires kind of checking things off a checklist before you can even remotely begin contemplating the idea, that whole process of beginning to think about having kids, it's defined by these sort of standards of readiness that are almost impossible to reach. They're very murky. And so you can always add more things to the checklist. We have to move in together. We have to have a pet. We have to try out, parenting the pet first before we can even contemplate discussing whether or not we want to have kids together. And so, what you do end up hearing from a lot of people is when you ask them, what would make it easier to embrace this decision to have kids right now? And they say, well, I don't know, I would want $1 million in the bank or something like that. It's just, right. These are very, very, very hard bars to reach for someone who's, in their late 20s, early mid 30s.
Yeah, go ahead, Tyler. Yeah.
I was just going to say really quickly.
Birds are going crazy.
I know the birds are popping off. I don't. The Montauk birds are built different, I guess. One of the things that I thought was really important about, and it's an observation you make in passing near the end of the novel, but that there's something really profoundly classist about this narrative of like financial readiness, insofar as it presumes, if it's not responsible, for example, for a relatively well-established, somewhat professionally mobile, young person in their 30s have a kid, that implies that all of the much poorer people in the US, let alone in developing countries, are being very irresponsible by having children in a moment of less financial security, right? And you point that out too about the climate change thing, right? Like if it's not responsible for those of us in America, which will fare relatively well because of the climate crisis to have kids, then what about people in poor countries? Is it really irresponsible for them? Right. And I found that I think that's an under-discussed element of this debate, is that when we talk so much about financial readiness, and I have to go through these life stages in particular, there's a way in which implicitly there's a kind of shame that's being put on people who, with different financial means and different educational tracks, who are not making those decisions, quote unquote, responsibly, according to that sort of tiered narrative. But anyway, sorry, go ahead, Jay.
Oh, yeah, no, I actually was going to ask the same thing, which was, I think that one of the parts that I found totally fascinating was your discussion of slow love. Slow love is, I think, a term that I don't remember who came up with it, but somebody came up with as the idea of like that you should do what you were talking about, Anastasia, where you sort of go through multiple partners to try and find the perfect child rearing couple, right? The person who's going to be responsible and maybe have good genes or something like that. I don't know. I always find that, I don't know. I guess I missed out on the entire, my wife and I have been together for, I don't know how long, 15 years or something. So I kind of missed out on the whole internet dating thing. And so this is all sort of foreign to me. And also we kind of rushed in and we're basically, I think it was a week. No, it wasn't a week. We lived together after basically 3 weeks or a month or something. Maybe it's too much personal information, but so for me personally, it's like, I was just like, well, whatever. Like, let's, I was so broke at the time too. I had $300 and I was like, it legitimately doesn't matter what I do. I have $300. Like, what possibly could go wrong? But, now we have 2 kids, whatever. And obviously not everything ends like that, but I found this part so fascinating because it's something, I haven't really experienced, or I haven't been on dates with people who feel this way, but it seems to be quite ubiquitous amongst the group of people who you are surveying, who are mostly middle to upper middle class and educated people, right? And that it seems to place so much pressure on every single interaction. And that I do think that the question of delay is interesting because, it's also there are also deficits that come up from that, right? You can be financially perfect, but you'll be older, you'll be tired, right? I had a kid a year and a half ago. I'm 44 years old when my kid when that kid when my son graduates from high school, I'll be 58 or something like that, right? I think. Yeah, like 58, 59. That's pretty old, I might not make it that long, right? My kids love playing with their grandparents, right? They're of an age where they can still play with their grandparents, where they can still see their grandparents. And so I found that part to be really interesting because it seemed to so much preference this sort of elusive and completely malleable bar of what financial health means. And so I was wondering, the question that I have for you was like, is there more to it? Like, is there actually a sense where people can say, I want to have this thing, right? For a lot of the respondents that you guys surveyed or the people that you talked to, is there something specific that, like, is it like, I want to own my own house, for example, right? Or I want to be able to send my kids to daycare, which I will say is extremely expensive in America. But I totally agree with you. Like, for a while, I thought about moving to South Korea during the pandemic because, like, I mean, South Korea very famously has the lowest childbearing rate in the world. And yet, if you go to South Korea, you can put your kid in daycare for $300 a year. It's crazy.
They pay you.
They basically pay you. If you're like, they're like, oh my God, you have children,
Two.
Yeah, two. Here's like a check, basically, right? And like they'll do everything. Like if your kids can't really speak Korean, like many, like like Kyopo kids do, which is like kids who are immigrants who grew up in America, their kids, they'll like give them basically free Korean language instruction. Like they do all this sort of stuff, and yet it's not like the birth rate is like going back up, right? So yeah, for the people that you talked to, what was the sense of that financial bar? Was there one?
So I do want to do, like, let's do just one disclaimer. So
Right.
it so happens to be that both Rachel and I do think that people should be able to have and raise children with state support. We think it's a
Right.
legitimate and
Yeah, of
worthy
course.
political
Yep.
goal. And I think they should do that with human dignity. So just to say, we are for the policies that people are pushing in this regard. We just don't think this is the reason why people are not having kids. Now, to the specific question, Jay, you're saying, oh, do they have a specific goal? And so here, I just emphasize something that Rachel kind of said quickly, which is that it's essential to this standard of sufficient readiness that it's incredibly hazy and murky. So it's not just high, it's also indeterminate, which that makes it very hard to reach. And the same thing goes when you're thinking about standards of romantic compatibility. So you're saying, so what we kind of quote somebody as discovering is this paradigm of slow love. The reason why people are doing everything so carefully is to make sure they have maximal compatibility. So you hear that language of the dating apps. You have to trust me on this, Jay, if you don't know what I'm talking about. People
Yeah.
are trying to have a 99% compatibility and not just a 93% compatibility. We've actually heard people talk about their dating lives this way. But what is it to be 100% compatible with someone? That is completely indeterminate. And every relationship, most relationships come with challenges. So, and that kind of challenge could be experienced as a reason to doubt your relationship. And maybe you should throw a back. How did somebody put it, Rachel? Maybe I should throw back my 96 percentile. Maybe I can get a 98 percentile, and then we won't fight. So it's, in terms of the standard, it's really important that it's actually not determinate at all. You do sometimes hear people speak about in absolute terms. So they'll say, well, if I didn't have to do any childcare whatsoever, which kind of amounts to if I didn't have, I don't know what, see your kids, raise your kids, right? So they say, if it didn't hurt my ability to do absolutely anything I do right now in life, including travel, career, friends, sleep. So it's kind of, well, zero. I'm willing, if I can pay zero for my children, maybe I'll consider having some. But other than that, no, there's definitely no convergence around like a real standard. And I think that is part of the point, because it's an expression of the fact that people are feeling precarity and uneasiness and uncertainty about what role children should play in their lives, how should they be fitting into their life? And that's why they're thinking of it as this kind of afterthought of something that they may be ready for one day, and not something that they're building their life around. They're not having kids to grow with the child, to find out who they are by having the child. But it's something that you have to do when absolutely everything is completely sad. I did want to say, just to add something to what you said before, Jay. So you're saying, this idea of dating with a view to maximizing compatibility needs to be complicated. And this is one of the real, true, fresh discoveries we made while working on the book. Is a part of what's going on right now for middle and upper middle class people, and also working class people increasingly, is that you're not even dating with a view to finding your baby daddy. In fact, it's really important that you're not dating with a view to starting a family at all. So you're maximizing romantic and sort of social compatibility. But as you're listing all the things that matter to you in a partner, whether or not they have kids does not make the list. And if you were to date with a view to having a child with that person or starting a family, that is perceived as something that can really devalue the relationship. It's the kind of thing that makes you compromise. It's the kind of thing that is a recipe for disaster. And this isn't just a few anecdotes. There's an amazing research, sociology research of interviews with many, many women who have considered egg freezing or have gone through egg freezing, and they ask them why you do it, expecting to find what. Of course, they're doing it to advance their careers. They want to be able to work forever. They don't have to turn down any promotion. That wasn't the case. The reason women were thinking of freezing their eggs was that they wanted to separate their romantic timeline from their family timeline. They wanted to be able to date without having to worry about whether or not that relationship is going to lead to family. So
and there was a sense.
I'll just do one more sentence, Rachel, and then you'll qualify. But just to make clear, so they're not just infinitely postponing. There's not just like this crazy standard of whether or not I should even be with this person. It's really important that I don't check whether or not this person wants kids, wants to have them with me, etc. So the kind of self-evident logic of infinite postponement and avoidance is, we think, really a major driving factor of why people are not finding room for thinking about kids in their lives.
And the thought also that was expressed in that study by Eliza Brown and Mary Patrick was that to date with a view toward family would actually be counterproductive to the goal of finding love, that it would be to date inauthentically, that you would end up, instead of, finding your soulmate or something, you would end up settling. And that's something that is just really anathema to a lot of people today, men as well as women.
Yeah, that's I'm getting hives thinking about this, but it's more like it's just like, what are you talking about? You just like meet somebody, you get along, and then you just work it all out. Like, what do you guys like? What is it? Like, you're optimizing romantic love is like, it's so weird. Like, what do you mean? Like, how many walks you take on the beach holding hands or something like that? I don't mean to be so cynical, but I'm just like that. I when I got to that part of the book, I think that was why it stuck with me so much. I was just like, wow, it's like look, I don't begrudge people for believing in this stuff, but it just seems, for me, it's like, well, the working through the problems or whatever seems to be the point of it all, right? And having kids and starting a family, having a life together. But like, I guess there's just some, like, the idea that you should have a whole courtship or whatever like that, it almost feels like strangely conservative to me, right? Like that it's that there's this sense of romantic love, and that it needs to be fully in blossom before the children arrive, and that can take anywhere between 2 to 15 years or something like that. Also seems to be I would be so stressed out, I would just put it this way, if I went through this. But I'm a dude, so one of the things I wanted to talk about was that exactly, because I will say, I think that one thing I will say about the book is that I I realized while reading the book, I'm probably not doing enough around the house, and I was yeah, which if you want a pull quote for the back of the book, There it is.
Can we get your wife on that? Like,
yeah,
I had the
blurb.
same thought, Jay. My
I
wife saw the
know.
book. She's like, "Oh, I want to read that." And I was like, "Oh, you should definitely read it." And then I was like, "Oh shit, I don't think I am doing enough around the house
Yeah,
either.
no, I
Maybe
really did, because
I'll just lose the copy of the book."
I do it's not that I'm not pitching in at, but I pitch in focused ways, right? So, for example,
Sorry.
my entire daughter's soccer career is my
Okay.
purview, and that's a lot
Okay.
of her life, right? Or teaching her to read before kindergarten, which was like a big deal. I'm a kind of tiger parent, honestly, but like, like teaching, I was like, you have to learn to read before getting to kindergarten. That was a lot of that was on me. Driving around to her various things is on me. And, you know, but I realized that when reading this, that like some of the frustration that my wife might feel is because there are things that we should both do and have conversations about. And it reminded me of the way in which a lot of parents parent these days, which I found, especially if they have two kids and one of them is a little bit older than the other one, is that you live separate lives, right? Like one of the parents takes care of one kid and the other one drives the other kid around to practices and stuff like that. And that you kind of are shifts passing in the night in a way, and that it is alienating in a lot of ways. And I think it does lead to a type of loneliness. And that I think one of the things that is in this book that I think people will find refreshing is, it's not just kind of like this philosophical conversation that it seems like the part of it which seems more pragmatic is like, okay, this is, like men, you kind of have to do your part too, right? So do you want to just talk about that? Like, like why the decision to include that type of conversation in there and like what the findings were that prompted it?
Right. So I find it fascinating that both of you, as parents, were shamed by this into wanting to do more around the house. Because I think the only way it is raised in the book is by saying, look, everyone knows that men are supposed to be as much around the house. Let's look at this other thing. But I like that for you, that's what stuck.
Yeah.
And I welcome that. So good. You guys go off and do more around the house as parents. And I'll say another thing that doesn't, I think, apply to you as much, which is, while I thought most people know that men are supposed to do as much around the house, something that I don't think we are thinking about at all, really, I haven't seen anyone raise this point aside for us, is the fact that, well, we know that men are supposed to do things when the kids are there. We have an almost taboo in place on men, again, on the left and in liberal circles, taking an interest in the question of children. So we've talked to men who would say, we would sort of pose the question, what would happen if you raised the question of children in a dating situation and say, well, I would feel creepy. I would feel controlling. I would certainly not do that. And so as a result, you have men kind of sidelined from the conversation, creating ever more isolation and seclusion on women having to choose it. And I think, which one of you asked the question? I think, Tyler, you said, you recognize, maybe we don't use the word narcissism, but maybe there's narcissism. I think that's a psychological label, and it might be apt many times, but there's so much in our society and how we're sort of regulating the conversation around children that's contributing to that. And one of the big things is that we're not encouraging people to have that conversation early. We're not encouraging young people to think about it critically. One of the things that we say, if the goal of feminism is to empower women to make choices and like control their lives and live fulfilling lives, we should be encouraging them to think about fertility early, not making it a taboo. We should be encouraging men to be participating in the conversation so they're not having to make those decisions alone. At one point, we said, I don't want to choose what to eat for dinner or what movie to watch with somebody who just tells me, whatever you want, honey. I want, it's annoying when people do that. So imagine having to do that when the question of children comes up. And this isn't an exaggeration. People will say, yeah, I don't, whatever, you tell me, like, what are your thoughts? So,
and that's a real psychological burden. Yeah. It's like, it's a huge,
really is, yeah.
It's a huge thing. And it makes it so hard for women in relationships to decide, okay, yeah, I guess I'm going to do it if you're just kind of, meh about it. And how then, when you think about all of the work that goes into raising children, it really raises the stakes for those women to get the decision right. And then they have to think, okay, I guess I'm going to have to assign tasks to my partner or something so that they'll, take an equal part in raising this child. So it's really important, I think, for men to both for themselves to get involved in this decision earlier, and not kind of defer to their partner, not raise it ever. And also, I think it would help their partners as well.
Yeah, no, I'm scanning my own friends. I think I have one male friend who told me and sort of was very public about the fact that he wanted kids from a young age. His name is Gleb. He's wonderful. And but it harmed him in dating, because it was kind of a lot of pressure, right? And then he found somebody, and now they have a sort of commune in upstate New York. It's wonderful. They built like a banya, and he brings people out. It's great. I mean, he's
Sounds
like
ideal.
in many ways my model for life. But when he was 23, he was cameraman on the TV show I worked on, and he said to me in the office once, he was like, I really want, I hope I'm not giving away too much. Maybe I'll bleep out his name, but he said, he was like, I really want to have a family. And I was like, you just graduated from college, bro. Like, and then he was like, but he's
When
the
did he have
only,
kids,
they have two now.
How old was he when he had them?
I think 29 or something like that, 30.
It's not even that old. I mean, not that
Right.
young.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I was
so
going to
it took
say
him a while.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if you have them young, one thing we don't, and look, everybody has to make this choice on their own. It's not always possible to have them young. You have them in your 20s, they're out of your house by the time you're 40.
I know.
You have money to travel. You have people today at 40 still exercise. They think of themselves as young.
I know.
The self-evidence, I just have to, the self-evidence, there's so many of these reasons why we think it's so progressive. I mean, in kind of a deep sense, right? So it's the enlightened way to do things is to wait. I wish I didn't have tiny children. I love my children very much. I wish they were grown. They're not going to leave my house for 20 years.
Oh, I know.
As you're saying,
chase
Jay, I'll
this
be
1.5
old.
around all the time right now. And when I was 37 with our daughter, it was like totally fine. And now it's like, I'll just put it this way. It's a lot harder to chase this child who's trying to constantly injure himself around the house. Yeah.
And I think it's also why we think that when you have children, your life is over. Because the older you have them, the more on the other side of having children, there is, at least from a perspective of like a 20, 30-year-old, much less to look forward to. If I told you your kids will be out of your house by the time in your early 40s, that to me, that was like a real paradigm shift. I was like, oh, wow. Like,
yeah.
There are a lot of things I could do.
And I hear people say like, I can't have kids because I'll lose out on everything that I've built for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The key is, I guess it's Rachel, what you just said, right? That narrative or that type of language, right? I agree is quite ubiquitous amongst, the people I think, that we're talking about here, right? Which is the people that you surveyed, middle class, upper middle class group of people, and that they are getting that type of language from somewhere. One of the things that I was not expecting about this book, which I found totally interesting, is that a lot of it is like a sort of literary review of fiction, parenting books, articles that were written. Like it is about text, right? And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and just why the decision to make it so literary, right? Like why it's in that way. It is quite unusual, I think, right? A lot of books that would have this title would be like almost an ethnography. I'm going to talk to 4 different parents, and this is what across the spectrum of X, Y, and Z, and here's what they all say, right? And I'm going to frame it all with like a personal narrative about my own feelings about this, right? Like that would be a typical book, I think. I'm sure that there are some versions of that. I bet some of those books are quite good. But, why so literary? And then Tyler has a lot of questions about eco-nihilism because that is actually what he studies. So, yeah.
Right. I mean, go ahead. on you.
Oh, for us, the literary analysis, first of all, it came naturally because Rachel and I are both, like, part of the way for us to understand what is driving and possessing people is by looking at the literature that they both produce and sort of love and are drawn to. And so literature makes appearances probably throughout the whole book, but the two biggest treatments are, as we've mentioned, of what's called the motherhood ambivalence literature and then climate fiction or ecolit. And with the motherhood ambivalence literature, we really felt that by looking at these books, we can show and sort of discover for ourselves something really essential about the way in which people from the outside especially are viewing motherhood right now, and what is the kind of ideal and standard for what is the right kind of attitude, like ethical personal attitude that one should take to the question. And you know, a lot of these novels were really lauded and celebrated for their honesty, and for the kind of service they were playing. And I don't want to downplay that. Like, it's really, you know, they were able to show that the experience of motherhood was a worthy literary subject and it's an incredibly important human experience, etc. But we felt that if we can point to what's missing in these novels, we can sort of break the spell of the narrative they were representing. So that was with the motherhood ambivalence literature, and also even just, you know, we don't even start there. We kind of put them in context of other ways in which feminine centered or feminine protagonist novels have been written, and just even noticing that shift. So from describing them in the third person or from describing them with kind of a stream of consciousness, you really have almost an overtaking of autofiction. And so, you know, it's incredibly solipsistic. The entire existence is in one's mind, and we thought that really captures something about how people are sort of forced to be thinking through this particular question and this particular experience in our time. And with Ecolit, which we know is, we were really looking forward to this conversation with Tyler about it, but with Ecolit, we thought it was remarkable that as people are trying to imagine the end, the kind of difference that you see in how they're doing it now from how they were doing it before. And in particular, in the like, so apocalyptic novels are not something new. There's a long history. Tyler knows about this history better than we do. But there was always something redeemable about humanity. There's a reason for hope. There was a protagonist, even if he's not a perfect hero, there was some reason to think that human beings both deserve and perhaps are capable of an effort to make human life like continue into the future. And what's remarkable about this genre that emerged, almost without exception, is that is completely absent from those novels. So what you see is sort of depictions of life coming to an end. The people to blame are humans. There's no one redeemable to be found. And the only kind of ethical heroes to look to are like children and animals. So adults are like irredeemable beings that are responsible for ruining the planet, and they're also completely ineffectual. So they neither deserve nor can make things better. And again, I think that's capturing something real about the zeitgeist. I think it's capturing something real about how people are at least tempted to think about what is kind of ethical challenge of climate change today. So that's why we delve deeply into the literature. We also like it.
Yes, we like it. And also we met at a literary magazine. So it is kind of,
True.
you know, how in some sense, like a starting point for some of these conversations. But we're really interested in why it is that these are the kind of dominant modes and narratives that people use to talk about these two big issues. And why are they so popular? What are these narratives giving people? So for the motherhood ambivalence literature, you'll hear from a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, who are actively trying to decide, do I want kids? Do I not want kids? What does it mean to be an enlightened, sophisticated, artistically minded woman today? And they turn to these books like Rachel Cusk, Sheila Heti, Rivka Galchen, and these are the ways that they try to kind of think through the decision with the books. But, you know, it's very hard to turn literature for very explicit guidance. It can't necessarily give that to you. And then when it comes to the climate fiction, these eco dystopian novels are getting to be really, really popular. There was a time when people thought it was like a bubble and people would stop wanting to read it. But in fact, they've become subway reads. People can't put them down, and there are more and more and more of them. And it ends up becoming this whole genre. And it was fascinating to us. Why is it that people want to read about these characters who are kind of so slovenly? The reflection that they give of humanity is really bleak. So trying to think through that helped us. It gave us a lens on this kind of bigger question about anti-humanism and these strains within our culture today.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I found really interesting and valuable about the kind of starting point for this book is that, I think those of us on the left, mostly rightly, but have a tendency to sort of prioritize materialist explanations for like why things are the way they are, right? And so one of those materialist explanations we already talked about, which is like finances. But another one is something like, the environment and climate change, right? And I think something that's really valuable about your book is you're not discounting those, right? You're like taking those materialist sort of questions seriously, but at the same time, you're also saying that there's like a psychological piece here, or there's a sentiment, there's like a sentiment or mood that is also inflecting this. And it's not like if you just look at the material conditions, you're not going to be able to explain why people are feeling the way they are about children, because there's this mood or ambivalence that suffuses this question. And the narrative element of this seems to me so central. So I really thought like you're drawing on these novels and films like Children of Men was really productive, because I do think just as much as there are material explanations for why we think about kids the way we do, or at least those of us who are in a certain socioeconomic strata, there's also like this narrative dimension. It's like a kind of storytelling we have that isn't always a really productive one. But I did want to ask about, the sort of like eco-fiction, climate fiction angle to this, because I, even as I teach a course called climate fiction, and even as my work focuses on sort of the history of apocalyptic anxieties, I really think climate fiction is very bad. I think it's bad literarily, but I also think it's like bad for the culture. I often joke that climate fiction is just like left-wing Turner Diaries, right? But rather than like a race, you still have the race wars, but actually this time it's like the like good brown races rather than the white races that you get in the right-wing version of this, right? And you have like these other left-wing concerns about the end of the world, which are environmental, et cetera, right? But all the same concerns that the future is going to be a hellscape of Hobbesian barbarism. It's like a left-wing version of that like old right-wing fantasy, and I think it's really damaging. But I also think it's like really ahistorical in a certain sense. When people talk, and you gesture to this in the book, but when people talk about like, oh, like climate change is going to be bad, et cetera, which is true. Like I think climate change is very bad. But at the same time, as somebody who studies the history of these ideas, there's not been a generation alive in human history that did not think theirs was the last generation, right? I mean, if you look at the Cold War, people thought, we didn't have very long. If you look in the 19th century, there was a widespread religious apocalypticism where people thought the end of days were imminent, right? Like you can look at the bubonic plague or whatever. Like we've always had these apocalyptic anxieties. But
I think they're also fantasies, Tyler. I don't think they're just anxieties.
Yeah.
It's a fantasy. I mean, it's something really exciting about being the last generation on Earth. It's very
Totally.
liberating in some ways. So yeah, I don't think it's just an anxiety.
And it lets you off the hook because you don't have to bother picking up
Totally.
your litter if no one else is going to inherit the Earth.
At some point, I had crafted this argument that the best way to die was in the apocalypse. That you should, when the rapture comes, that's when you should, if you're lucky, you'll die in the rapture, right? Because then you don't have to worry about anything else. And also, it's not your fault, right? You're just like, I don't know. What was I supposed to do about the rapture?
Yeah, I think so. It's not on me. No, but, so like one of the things that interests me as somebody who thinks about these things historically is that previous moments of like during the Cold War or, in the 19th century or whatever didn't lead to these collapsing rates of people wanting to have children, right? Like there have been, and that's where I think you thinking about the psychological and narrative and storytelling practices and not just the materialist ones are really important, because there have been other moments of great financial precarity. There have been other moments of soaring inequality. There have been other moments of being on the brink of nuclear Armageddon, for example, and yet we didn't have this collapsing birth rate in the same kind of way. So I guess I'd love to hear you talk more about why do you think, I mean, I know you're very generous in your reading of like, you understand why people have these anxieties, et cetera, and you don't dismiss them. But at the same time, it does feel like those explanations don't really hold water because we've had similar moments of anxieties like this that didn't produce this particular result. So do you think there's something specific about our moment, or do you think climate change is being used as, I don't want to say an excuse, it sounds kind of harsh, but as like, this pre-existing tendency of ambivalence about children is now just being grafted onto these various apocalyptic explanations to retroactively justify a choice or ambivalence that was kind of made independent of those.
So I think the answer is in a way both. So I think it is very important to notice the way in which precisely what you're drawing attention to, and specifically about the kind of climate change antinatalism, about the way in which it's a version of a kind of question that we see people raise, if you know your intellectual history, in philosophical debates and in literature for millennia. So people have always asked, is human life so full of suffering, so full of evil and harm doing that maybe we shouldn't be perpetuating and we shouldn't be reproducing? However, it's also, we think, a unique moment. And there's two things to say about why it's unique. The first thing to say about the way it's unique is that this concern was abstract. So philosophers thought it, a certain kind of poet might raise it as a question, but it wasn't something that people felt like something they need to answer. In other words, kids were, or having children was kind of an essential part of what it was to be human for many people. Well, today having children is something that we feel the need at some level or other to justify. So that is unique. I would also say that I think what if somebody says, well, why is it? Why right now these kind of concerns that we've always seen are something that being felt like something we need to give an answer to? And here I want to say, first of all, the research right now suggests it is not a salient concern in terms of the practical deliberation. So we point even to a study that was by a climate activist, like somebody who's very sympathetic to climate concerns. And he surveyed climate activists, environmentalists about their decision to have children. And he found that people who are already leaning no or have decided against it will play up the political cause. He calls it the weaponization of reproduction. And I think that is the case that for very few people it is decisive, certainly not with the people that we talk to. Climate change is not decisive. But if you look at media, if you look at the public discourse, all antinatalist concern is done through climate change. And I think the thing it's pointing to is, I would put it this way, concerns with the future are always concerns about the present. So a concern about the future and saying, why is the future looking any more bleak than it did before? I think that's a good question. But I think it's also a question of, what does this mean about how people view the reasons for their existence? What does it mean about their capacity to value this, like what it is that we're doing as human beings on this planet at this moment? And I think what we see as an expression of kind of a crisis of faith in what we're doing right now. And that's why I think when we come to the positive argument of the book, what we say is, if you want to restore faith in a human future, a conception of the value of a human future, it's good that there is a human future. You need to ask, what is it that we value in our own lives today? And so I would say that what has changed is sort of people's capacity to justify and embrace the present. So the tendency, the climate fiction novels, they'll talk about a really grim future, but what we see a lot of people are talking about today, they talk about an irredeemable present.
There's this really oppressive sense of humanity as being at fault. And so a lot of people end up thinking like, well, how do I reproduce that? And when you do see the few kind of nascent arguments that have come out thus far about, is there a way of justifying having kids from a leftist point of view? They often are premised on this idea of hope that, okay, the future generations, they'll figure it out. We can believe that having children is okay, but maybe not like good, but fine. If you want them, you can have them. Because, every new generation is a new possibility for regeneration. But their actual diagnoses of the lives we're leading today is really, really grim. There's almost nothing to commend humanity. Like, our form of life is incredibly unequal. It destroys the environment. And so, like Anastasia was saying, we feel that these attempts at justifying having kids that rely only on this recourse to hope end up falling short because, why should we assume that the next generation is going to do any better than we have?
Right. Yeah. And it also, I think something that underlies the book also is that these concerns in some ways are a new form of class distinction, I think, right? It's something that I've noticed in my own personal life that it feels like there is a set of concerns about the future that are stated in the broadest terms possible, right? Like in a way, it's being like humanity needs X, right? Or humanity needs me to do X, or the environment needs me to do Y, right? But that you would, if you ask that same person, well, what about this family who is of a different economic strata than you, perhaps different, ethnic background, different cultural background, then they'll just say, oh, well, that person, it's almost like they don't count within this calculus, right? Like they're just going to do what they do. And I guess I have found that just in my own life as a parent, that that type of stuff is quite alienating, right? And it's quite restrictive in the ways in which it thinks about a community. It is basically like we can save the world, and only we can make these decisions. Everyone else is just like they're just breeding because that's what they do, type of thing, right? And yeah, I felt like that undercurrent was in the book quite a bit because and I found that the most satisfying part was that question that Tyler brought up at the beginning of like, look, if we are basically saying that climate change is I think you called it like a startling conclusion, it reaches a startling conclusion, right? That basically means that if we're preparing kids for a world where they're going to have less suffering, right? If that is our calculus, and that we believe that climate change is going to lead to mass suffering, then we must also then acknowledge that wealthier people in wealthier countries will suffer less under climate change. Therefore, and this all follows. This is what I mean. Like the debate part of my brain starts getting excited about it. Therefore, it follows then that if you follow all that logic, then basically rich people in rich countries are the only people who it's moral to have children. Um, and then I feel like once you reach that conclusion, then a lot of this stuff just falls apart, right? Unless you actually are like a Malthusian, like a population bomb type of guy, right? Which I don't think any of these people are, right? And I don't think they are in any type of I did first think that they would never admit to that, but secondly, I think they would never admit to that because they sincerely don't believe that, right? Like they're not Malthusian eugenicists or whatever. And so, yeah, I don't know. I found all of that conflict to be quite generative and cool. And yeah, I share your assessment of climate fiction, which Tyler and I did an episode on Octavia Butler, and I had never read Parable of the Sower. And I was like, this is the bleakest fucking book I've ever read in my entire. No, it really was. Like, I think it still is the bleakest book I've ever read, and that book has had this huge sort of resurgence right now. It's interesting to think about why.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really fascinating to ask what are people getting from it? So why are people getting off in like, looking in a mirror and seeing a monster? And we sort of suggest there's this, in a way, there's something gratifying of this ability to pass judgment, but really the kind of judgment that you don't have to do anything about, because I'm externalizing and I'm passing judgment on these other humanities. So I both get to kind of rid myself of guilt, but I don't have to pay any price because people will consume them. It's like candy. And it's just, as you say, once you read a couple of these, you think like, what possible pleasure? I mean, there's something masochistic about consuming these. And so I think that's really important, really fascinating. And I think in terms of to go back to this point about you're right that we are this idea that ambivalence about having children is a class privilege. And I think there's a kind of, we can almost call it metaphysical conception that is underlying the argument that you were very nicely laying out for us, which is that what I'm responsible for in becoming a parent is sort of like the sum total of harms and benefits that my child will experience. So I have a child, that child encounters difficulties. It encounters, callousness and human failure, natural failure, systemic failure. And some, in addition to all the agents that are or aren't responsible for the harms that my child is having, in addition, I'm also responsible for absolutely all of them. And that's kind of the beginning of that calculus. So in asking, can I have a child? I sort of say, well, is it responsible to have a child that could possibly, no one can rule it out, would experience sort of worlds of pain, tremendous amounts of suffering. And as you say, and we point out, well, here's one thing that suffering correlates with your socioeconomic status. So now it looks like you should be, you're much more morally justified to have kids the more you can kind of in advance guarantee that you can take care of it.
Yeah.
As opposed to this idea of responsibility for all the harms and benefits your child will have. One of the things that we try to, like a shift we tried to affect, is to get people to think again in what I think is a much more intuitive way of thinking about the responsibility of a parent, which isn't for all the harms and the benefits, but what you're responsible in being a parent is preparing your child to the best of your abilities to encounter a world that is imperfect as an imperfect being. You are not all powerful, my child, and I have to prepare you to deal with not just harms, but like to learn about evil, to experience tragedy and loss and grief. And that's my responsibility. So I certainly know people can fail as parents. And if you have no intention of taking on that responsibility, then maybe you really aren't justified morally in having in being a parent. But the question isn't how likely is your child to feel harm and you being responsible for that. What you're responsible for is the more likely they are to experience harm, the more, and from a certain perspective, it's brave of you to be willing to shoulder that responsibility of preparing them for that world. And so hopefully people will find this message a little empowering.
I think
You had a great. Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think for older generations, it was easier for them to take on that responsibility. They understood that the job of a parent was to transmit to their children kind of a certain set of like values and prepare them for the world, give them a vision of what a flourishing life would look like. But now, the expectation is that it's sort of the children that define happiness for themselves. So that just for prospective parents, it ends up adding just another, thing that they have to sort of suss out. It makes parenting really intensive. And it also means that they feel extra burden. Well, like how, if I have to guarantee if what will make me successful as a parent is that my child is ultimately happy, but then the world is bad. Well, how do I jump into that decision in the first place?
Yeah.
No, totally. I mean, you have a great line. The concerns expressed by those wondering whether it's right to bring children into a warming world can't be dispelled by fact checking, right? Like you point out that, which I thought was lovely, because you point out that there, in the 2010s, there was a lot more doomerism about the climate, and now things have shifted a bit where there's still doomerism, but there's been, some scientific pushback against the notion of like full-blown apocalypse, like we were seeing in, the narrative in like 2015 or 2016 or whatever. But you like make this point that people seem really desperate to just have like a full accounting of the facts of the future before making a decision. And I think the point that you can't, fact checking doesn't solve the parental ambivalence question, because, the future is inherently unpredictable and mired in tragedy and so on and so forth. And just taking this sort of accounting approach to the decision isn't really going to get us very far. And anyway, I found that really insightful as because I do think and you mentioned that in the context of climate change, but also in Flex, like the sort of financial piece and everything else, right? Like I want to make sure my ducks are in a row, and I've minimized risk in a whole host of ways, and I have a good, clear idea of what the future is going to be like, and that I can mete it out in these particular ways. And that's just not tenable, because that's not how lives work, and that's not how the future works. So I found that really, really especially compelling.
Yeah, and you see on Twitter, when there are inevitably these arguments over, why are millennials and Gen Zers having fewer kids or whatever, you see people getting into these debates where they're like, well, it's not like it was, life was better in the Middle Ages, but like that's not going to get you to decide to have a kid, that, like, who cares?
I read this tweet and it made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Yeah, no, it's those. I find that I just have one more question, and then Tyler, I don't know if you do, and then because we said an hour 15 minutes here, but I was wondering if you thought about the role of television, right? In terms of the broadcasting that it did. I was thinking about this myself because I've been writing. My column that I do, I just basically split up into chapters, and I just write about like 10 things about the same subject. So right now I'm writing about parenting, which is I'm actually going to write about your book for this week. But the one of the things that I was curious about was, I was trying to think of television as a way that it sort of gives people reassurance that families are good, right? And so when I was growing up, obviously the show, there's much more of like what people call like, I don't know. I don't know. Actually, I'm using this term wrong. There's only like 6 channels and everyone watched the same show. So we watched The Cosby Show or Brady Bunch or whatever, right? This sort of celebration of family. And then now it's like you had the show Modern Family, huge hit, right? That was a very popular show. And that was kind of like I don't know what the best way to put it, but it was kind of like the liberal fantasy of like what families should be, right? Multicultural and, diverse in terms of gender and sexuality, et cetera, right? And that it's all sort of this big happy mess, right? Are there things right now that you feel like are indicative of this type of either side of what you're talking about, right? Like, are there things that are pushing back in some sort of way? Or are there things that, or are there things that reflect it? Because I always say this on the show, and I always feel self-conscious about it because it feels like like a sort of hippie brag, but like I don't know anything about television, right? I know that the show The Bear exists, and I was like, it seems to exist in a
Bear's
restaurant.
so good.
I was like, this is legitimately my thinking. I was like, are there TV shows? I was like, what is a TV show? I was like, The Bear. And I was like, I think that's in a restaurant. I don't think it's about children. So like, are there television shows or movies that you thought or that you think are either indicative of either side of this?
Yeah. So, I mean, the family sitcom or the family kind of TV show was a real cornerstone of like American television for, 50 years. And it's still, an important facet of it. But now there's really a sense of most of the kind of the like protagonists of these shows, they tend to be independent women who aren't really attached to families. So you'll get kind of the like House of Cards protagonist or the, Succession or, like Captain, what's her name? Marvel, the like, what is she?
Can I just strengthen it?
Yeah.
Keep listing them, Rachel, but you could have said,
Yeah.
they're less oriented towards family. The heroes of the female protagonist does not have children or is incredibly ambivalent about having them.
Or a bad mom.
Or a very bad mom. So all the superheroes are women without kids. The spies, the stoners, the politicians. So, and again, it's this kind of corrective, right, to the idea that the only role that a woman can play in literature, and especially on TV, is the one of a wife and mother. But now what we see them is that, they could be everything. And there's a parenthesis, there's like, P.S., as long as they don't have kids. And so that's something that we found really interesting. And the reason why we sort of point this out is to show something about the mood today. So there's a real debate about whether or not our society is pro or anti-natalist and pro and especially anti-motherhood. So you'll have a lot of people say is like, there's this mandate that every woman must be a mother or else she's a failed woman and a failed human being. And on the other hand, you hear a lot of women say there's so much anti-natalist pressure. There's so much judgment against women having children. And what we try and introduce is the idea that both are true. So there's actually such a conflict and such a crisis of interpretation in our culture that I think both things are true. And we bring the TV as evidence to the fact that there's of this normative pressure at least sideline the question of children. But so we've really tried to rack our brain because we, as good debate bros, we wanted to make sure no one can bring an obvious objection. We could not, we could not find an example of a contemporary portrayal of a woman who is both in some way accomplishing excellence and is a non-terrible mother.
Yeah. And then you see sort of the one of the generation defining shows for millennial women was Girls on HBO. And it was about these, early 20s, then sort of late 20s, New York City creatives striving to establish themselves, and having this sort of extended adolescence in Brooklyn. And the show really typifies this kind of cultural narrative of you have to find yourself first. You can't think about having an adult existence. But then having a child, the show ends with Hannah Horvath getting accidentally pregnant, kind of as a deus ex machina. How is she ever going to grow up and kind of come to her senses? And it ends up just being, okay, I guess having a kid means you're an adult, and that period of your life is over.
Right. And the show ends. It's like the last thing that happens.
Yeah, it's like The Sopranos where Tony dies.
Yeah, fades to black.
But look what happens. It means there's nothing more to say. All the interesting stuff is over. She had a kid. The life is over. Done.
Yeah, no, that is true. I mean, I like that show, but I didn't realize it ended that way because I think it coincided with my general, I don't know what it is, thing where I was just I don't think I can watch these television shows anymore. There's too much basketball to watch or something. But I can't think of one either, honestly. I'm sure we're missing something, right? There's all sorts of network sitcoms and stuff like that. But when I even think about the network sitcoms, it's not really, because the corrective somebody would always say in a very annoying way is oh, you're just talking about stuff that very few people watch, but people write about in New York Magazine, mm-hmm. right? But that's not that actually isn't that true about this, right? The sort of Succession, for example, is a huge hit. They're all terrible mothers in that, right? And Shiv
Hacks, terrible
doesn't
mom.
have a kid. Right. So
even the right-wing version of this, something like Yellowstone, children are very much not part of the narrative either, So I don't know. That's really interesting.
Also, what's the most popular quote unquote millennial who's the most popular millennial novelist? Sally Rooney. Beautiful World, Where Are You? Her bestseller. She's now having a new book come out. The whole book has the same exact structure. It's millennials. How do you say humming and hawing?
Hemming and hawing.
This one. I should start every podcast by saying this is my third language. I'm very sorry for all I'm gonna do to the English language. So they do that for the whole novel, and then this protagonist, one of the protagonists, gets accidentally pregnant. Now, she's known this guy for her entire life. They've been on and off for 2 decades. They've now been together again for 18 months, and she still describes it as a complete sort of shock and accident, but decides to settle down. So they're having that decision made for them. Right. So now everyone is reading Sally Rooney, but she is very widely read. And so I think we should, I think you should throw that at anyone who said to you, this is just
even Mad Men, right? Which sort of it shows kind of this ideal in its decline, and sort of demystifies it. So I mean, I think what this kind of collage of cultural references ends up showing you is that family is no longer sort of seen as a normative ideal in the way it used to be.
Right.
It's not intelligible kind of for its own sake.
Even if shows like Mad Men or Girls are not watched at the time in huge numbers, they are actually the blueprint for which the future television shows are built, right? Because everyone wanted to make Mad Men, or people wanted to make Girls, and they end up making the network version of it. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a show like The Office, for example, has no children in it at all. That's like a wildly popular show that they're going to bring back, apparently. Yeah, the family sitcom seems to. I guess it's like the only show I can think about with children in it right now that's popular is Abbott Elementary, right? But that's within the context of school. I've never watched it, but I hear
And
good
it's
things
work.
about it. Right, and it is work. Right, right. No,
I think
I think your thesis is correct. Betty Draper was the one I thought about immediately in terms of the ambivalence of like if you think of her, and I think that she is sort of set up as this ideal on the show, mostly because she's so beautiful, she has great clothes, and she's like so stylish, you know. And so it's hard to like not have that person be idealistic in some sort of way. And then she's also just this totally ambivalent mother, like terrible mother in a lot of ways, right? Not terrible always, but also just kind of like could have the kids, couldn't have the kid, doesn't really matter to her, right? And that was like I don't know, I think it made that vision quite iconic in the way, same way that show kind of made everybody in a certain class of people quite, people like bought furniture and shit because of that show, right? Because it was so like there's all this mid-century. My friend like
repopularized the skinny tie.
yeah.
It's like single-handedly responsible for that terrible trend.
The Eames Lounge, like all this stuff.
Mid-century modern couches and skinny ties. That's how you know you're.
I knew someone in college who started smoking because of Mad Men.
Oh yeah, no, my friend started buying and selling mid-century modern furniture as like a side hustle while he was writing his book, and it was like at some point he was like, I think the whole Mad Men thing might be coming to an end. I gotta switch to a different thing.
But note that it didn't get them to move to the suburbs and have kids. So
yeah, that's one thing I want to say about all this. Is like some of us do live in the suburbs and have kids, you know. It's like,
just because we're nearing conclusion, I do want to say one really important thing, which is I don't think this is a book that's against ambivalence. What it's calling for is to kind of be true to ambivalence, which ambivalence, for like the way I see it, the point isn't that we should turn a blind eye to how much parenting could be frustrating, and it could be frustrating in different ways for men and women, and it could be difficult, and it could be, it's really asking us, how come we have no room for that other side of ambivalence? Like, ambivalence is supposed to have both components and both emotional valences, and we're using ambivalence, like I think in the case of Betty Draper, like we're using ambivalence to say she didn't like it. So it's almost like it's kind of like a euphemism for a mom who doesn't like it. And I think there is, it's very hard, as now that I am on the other side, it is very hard to capture what is worthwhile about this experience in its most quotidian terms, like in terms of its own self. But that's okay. That's a challenge. Like our literary minds should apply themselves to it. But the real point isn't to, because, you can hear it and say as if, we want parenting boosters. We just want, what we're saying is that the one-sided portrayals are contributing to the foreboding sense that this is a life-ending enterprise.
Got it. Well, no. This is a great episode, and we're very thankful that you came on. But Tyler, is there anything else you wanted to ask?
No. Thank you guys so much.
Are
This
there
was really...
birds that need to speak up in the background?
Yeah,
it actually got a lot better. I think it was maybe because it got at the beginning. I was like, oh my god, it sounds like we're in a pet store or something.
Yeah.
But, thank you for listening to the show. We do this every week. If you'd like to help keep the lights on, it is $5 a month at goodbye.substack.com or patreon.com/TTSG. And if you'd like to email us, it is timetoSayGoodbyePod@gmail.com. And we will have a link to purchase this book in the show notes. And, good luck with everything. And thank you for being
coming
on the
out
show.
June 11th.